I want to tell you about a man I'll call Robert, a woman I'll call Carol, and a man I'll call Wayne. None of those are their real names. I've changed enough details in each story that if they ever watch this video, they might not even recognize themselves in it. But I promise you every one of these stories is real, because I've lived here for years, and I've watched versions of this exact story happen more times than I can count on both hands. And here's the thing that nobody tells you before you get on the plane. It's never the scam you're braced for. You've already heard about the fake real estate deals, the guy who says he's a lawyer and isn't, the rental that turns out to belong to someone else. You'll dodge those. Most people do, eventually, because those scams look like scams. They have a shape you can recognize. The thing that actually empties expat bank accounts here doesn't look like a scam at all. It looks like the best thing that's ever happened to you. So today I'm not going to tell you one sad story and let you feel sorry for one guy and move on with your day. I'm going to show you the pattern, the actual mechanics of it, stage by stage, the way I've watched it play out again and again in different bodies, different ages, different bank account sizes, because once you can see the shape of it, you can't unsee it. And that, more than any warning I could give you, is what actually protects people. Let's start at the beginning, because the beginning is where it always looks the most harmless. Almost everyone who moves here is running from the same feeling, even if they'd never put it that way. It's not poverty exactly. It's the specific exhaustion of watching every dollar do less than it used to. Rent that eats half your check. A retirement number that looked fine on paper 20 years ago and now looks like a joke. The quiet math you do at the grocery store, putting things back before you get to the register. And then you land here, and for the first week or two, the relief is almost dizzying. A full meal costs what a coffee used to cost back home. Rent that would have been laughable in your old city suddenly fits inside a quarter of your monthly income. You stop doing the grocery store math. You start sleeping better, genuinely better, because the low hum of financial dread that had been sitting under every day for years finally goes quiet. I want to be honest with you. That part is real. The cost of living here genuinely can change your life, and I'm not here to tell you it's an illusion. It isn't. But relief has a side effect that nobody warns you about, and it's this. Relief makes you generous with your guard. When you've spent years white-knuckling every expense, and suddenly you don't have to, your instinct to double-check things goes soft. You stop asking, "Is this a good deal?" as hard as you used to, because everything already feels like a good deal compared to where you came from. That softness is stage one. It's not a mistake. It's just an opening. And the pattern doesn't need much of an opening to get started. Here's what almost nobody talks about in the videos that convince people to move here in the first place. The math gets easier. The loneliness gets harder. Usually both at once. Usually in the first 3 or 4 months. You don't speak the language. Not really. Not beyond ordering food and saying thank you. You don't have the 20 years of shared context that made your old friendships effortless. The guy from the job you had in your 30s. The neighbor who watched your kids grow up. The sister-in-law who just knows your moods. Here, everyone is friendly. Genuinely, warmly friendly. But being friendly is not the same as being known. There's a specific kind of quiet that settles into a life where you can go 3 or 4 days without saying a real sentence to another human being, just orders and greetings and small transactions, and it is a quiet that most people are completely unprepared for. I've talked to dozens of people who told me some version of the same thing. They didn't move here because they were lonely. They got lonely after they moved here, and the loneliness caught them off guard, because they'd spent so long planning the finances that they never once budgeted for the silence. And a person sitting in that silence, especially a person who just spent years being careful and tired and stretched thin, is not looking for a con artist. They're looking for one thing: to matter to somebody again. That need is completely human, completely reasonable, and it is exactly the door that the pattern walks through. This is where the stories start to branch, because the person who walks through that door wears a lot of different faces. Sometimes it's romantic, sometimes it's a friend. Sometimes, and this one surprises people, it's not a stranger at all. It's a relative by marriage or the adult child of a neighbor, someone who has every reason in the world to seem trustworthy because on paper they already are. But underneath all the different faces, the role they play is always the same. They are warm, they are attentive in a way that feels almost old-fashioned, almost like being courted, even when there's nothing romantic about it. They ask real questions and they actually listen to the answers, which after months of small talk with strangers can feel like the most intimate thing in the world. They remember details. They show up. And I want to be very careful here, because this is the part people get wrong when they hear stories like this secondhand. Not everyone who fits this description is running a con. Genuine friendships form here every single day. Genuine relationships form here every single day, real ones, lasting ones, and I'd never want to suggest that every warm local person who takes an interest in a lonely foreigner has an angle. That's not the point of this video, and frankly, that kind of suspicion poisons the good relationships just as easily as it fails to prevent the bad ones. The difference isn't in how the relationship starts, it's in what happens next. This is the part of the pattern I want you to actually memorize, because it's the hinge that everything else swings on. The first task is never big. It's never a business proposal, or an investment opportunity, or a request for a down payment on anything. It's small, specific, and almost impossible to refuse without feeling like a monster. A sick child. A medicine that costs less than a dinner out back home. A bill that's due tomorrow, and someone's face going tight with worry when they mention it, almost apologetically, like they hate even bringing it up. Robert's version of this, and remember, that's not his real name, was a tricycle repair, $90. He told me later he almost laughed at how small it felt to hand over. He'd spent more than that on a single dinner back in his old life without thinking twice. Carol's version was a school fee, small, specific, due by Friday, mentioned almost in passing, the way you'd mention the weather. Wayne's version was rented. His friend's cousin, who he'd met exactly twice, was about to be evicted, and Wayne had the money sitting right there. And what kind of person lets someone get evicted over an amount that wouldn't even cover a week of his old mortgage back home? None of them thought of it as a pattern starting. They thought of it as being a decent human being with more resources than the person in front of them, and on that first ask, in isolation, they were right. That's what makes it work. Here's the part of the mechanism that I think is the most important thing in this entire video, so I want you to really sit with it. After that first ask, something happens that has nothing to do with money at all. The gratitude comes back warmer than the amount could possibly justify. The attention deepens. The person who took the money doesn't disappear. They lean in closer. They call more. They show up more. For someone who's been running on loneliness for months, that response isn't just pleasant. It's intoxicating in a very literal, very biological sense. Being needed and being thanked and being wanted, stacked on top of each other, produces a feeling that most human brains will chase without even meaning to. And this is the moment the pattern quietly changes shape. It stops being about the money changing hands. It becomes about the feeling that follows it. Robert told me, months later, that somewhere around the third or fourth time he helped out, he stopped thinking of it as spending at all. He started thinking of it as investing in the one relationship in his life that made him feel like he still mattered to someone. That reframe is the whole trick. Not a lie told to him, a feeling he told himself, because it was easier to believe than the alternative. Once the reframe happens, the numbers stop being tracked the way they used to be. This is the stage where I've watched the most damage happen, because it's the slowest and the quietest. And slow, quiet damage is the hardest kind to notice from inside it. The tasks get a little more frequent, a little larger, never so large at any single moment that it feels like an alarm should go off. That's the part that makes it so effective. Nobody hands over their life savings in one conversation. It happens in 100 conversations, each one reasonable on its own, each one just slightly bigger than the last, each one wrapped in gratitude that makes saying no feel like a betrayal rather than a boundary. Carol's spending crept from around $600 a month to just under $1,400 over the course of a year. She didn't notice the total. She noticed the moments. This helped her. This mattered. This was worth it. And moments don't show up on a bank statement the way totals do. This is also, almost without exception, the stage where the person's savings account stops being a safety net in their own mind and starts being a resource for someone else's emergencies. That shift in how the money is mentally filed is, in my experience, the single clearest warning sign there is. If you find yourself thinking of your retirement savings as a fund for solving other people's problems rather than protecting your own future, you are already deep inside stage 6. Whether you can see it yet or not. Almost everyone I've talked to who went through this has a version of the same memory, a moment where something didn't add up, a pattern in the timing of the emergencies that felt just a little too convenient, a friend back home who gently asked a question that landed wrong, a quiet, cold feeling at 3 a.m. that they immediately talked themselves out of. Wayne's version of this moment was almost eerie in how textbook it was. He noticed that every single financial emergency seemed to surface within a day or two of him mentioning that he'd just gotten his pension deposit. He told himself it was a coincidence for nearly 4 months before he let himself really look at it. And here's why that noticing so rarely turns into action. By the time the warning sign shows up, the person isn't just weighing, is this true? They're weighing, if this is true, I have to give up the one relationship that made the last year bearable. That's an unbearable trade to consider, so the mind does what minds do when a thought is unbearable. It finds a reason to set it down. Wayne set him down for 4 more months. Eventually, for almost everyone in this pattern, there is a moment where the math becomes impossible to keep ignoring. A bank balance that's dropped further than makes sense. A friend or family member back home who finally says the quiet part out loud. A moment of clarity that arrives, often, at 3 a.m, uninvited. And when that moment lands, almost everyone does the same thing. They bring it up gently, carefully, not as an accusation, but as a question, because some part of them is still hoping to be told they're wrong. Robert brought it up over dinner, phrased so softly it barely qualified as a question at all. He told me the reaction was immediate and completely disproportionate to how gently he'd asked, hurt, wounded, almost accusatory in return, as if he'd been the one doing something wrong by noticing. And faced with that reaction, he did what almost everyone in this pattern does. He apologized. He backed off. He told himself he must have misread it, because the alternative, that the last year of connection had been, at least in part, a transaction, was more than he could hold. This is the stage that gives the pattern its name, because it's the part that repeats with almost mechanical consistency. The moment the money slows down for real, not a pause, not a gentle correction, but a real and lasting change. The warmth slows down right alongside it. Not always instantly. Sometimes it fades over a few weeks, the calls getting shorter, the visits getting rarer, some new excuse always available. But it fades. And by the time it's fully gone, the person is left holding two losses at once. The money, which they can at least count and understand, and the relationship, which they can't because they're still not entirely sure, even now, which parts of it were real. Robert's savings had dropped from just over $30,000 to under $4,000 by the time he finally fully understood what had happened. Carol's number was smaller, but her story ran faster. 11 months from arrival to empty. Wayne, the one who'd noticed the pattern in the timing and set it down for 4 months, lost almost everything he'd rolled over from a small pension buyout, close to $22,000, in just over a year. None of them are unusual. None of them are foolish. I want to say that as plainly as I can, because it's the part people get wrong every single time they hear a story like this secondhand. They weren't gullible. They weren't naive. They were lonely and generous and human. And the pattern is specifically built, not necessarily by cold calculation in every single case, but by the emotional mechanics of the situation itself, to turn exactly those good qualities against the person who has them. I want to slow down here, because I think this is the most important thing in the entire video, more important than any of the individual stories. Every one of these people had, at some point, access to all the information they needed to see what was happening, the timing of the emergencies, the gap between what was reasonable and what kept getting asked, the way the warmth tracked the money instead of the other way around. None of them were missing the facts. What they were missing was permission to act on the facts, because acting on them meant giving up something that had become genuinely load-bearing in their emotional life. And that's not a character flaw. That's how humans work. We are not built to coldly audit the people who make us feel less alone. We are built to protect those relationships, sometimes past the point where protecting them stops making sense. That's why "just don't be naive" is such useless advice. It's not a knowledge problem. It's a structural one. The pattern doesn't work because people are dumb. It works because it's engineered, sometimes deliberately, sometimes almost accidentally, by people who've simply learned what works, around one of the most powerful and legitimate needs a human being has: the need to matter to somebody. So if the problem isn't information, what actually helps? A few things, and I want to give them to you plainly, because I think this is the part that's actually useful, more useful than just feeling sad about Robert and Carol and Wayne. The first is tracking totals, not moments. The pattern survives on the fact that each individual ask feels small and reasonable in isolation. It cannot survive a running total that you actually look at, not a mental estimate, an actual number, written down, updated every time. $100 feels like nothing. $4,000 over 8 months feels like something worth a hard conversation with yourself. The second is noticing the timing, the way Wayne eventually did, just sooner than he did. If financial emergencies seem to arrive suspiciously close to your own deposits, that correlation is data, not paranoia. You're allowed to notice it without deciding what it means yet. The third, and I think the hardest one, is building more than one relationship before you need any of them to hold your whole emotional weight. Loneliness is the opening the entire pattern depends on. A life with 2 or 3 real connections, other expats, language partners, a hobby that puts you around the same people every week, doesn't just feel nicer. It structurally protects you, because no single relationship gets to become the only thing standing between you and the silence. And the fourth is this. If you ever notice yourself avoiding a hard question because you're afraid of what the answer might cost you emotionally, that avoidance is itself the warning sign, not the answer. The fact that you're managing your own feelings around finding it out. I don't want to end this video making it sound like every relationship formed here is a countdown to disaster, because that isn't true. And I think stories like this, told carelessly, can actually make people worse off, suspicious of everyone, isolated on purpose, which just recreates the loneliness that made the pattern possible in the first place. I know plenty of people here whose local friendships and relationships are exactly what they look like. Warm, mutual, unremarkable in the best sense of the word. The difference I've noticed, watching both kinds up close for years, isn't in how warm the relationship feels. It's in how it holds up under a boring, ordinary conversation about money, whether both people can talk about a request plainly, without it curdling into hurt feelings and distance the moment a question gets asked. That's really the whole test. Not, does this feel too good to be true? Almost everything good feels a little too good at the start. The test is smaller and quieter than that. Can you ask a plain question and still be standing in the same relationship 5 minutes later? If the answer is yes, you're probably fine. If the answer is no, if the relationship gets colder the moment you get more careful, you already have your answer, whether you're ready to admit it or not. I've watched too many people learn that the expensive way. I'd rather you learn it from 3 people who aren't even real names. Take care of yourselves out there. And if this is where you are right now, a few months in, a friendship that feels like the best thing that's happened to you, and a quiet number in the back of your mind you haven't quite let yourself add up. Do the math, just once. You can always decide it means nothing, but you deserve to actually look.